Okay,
Be happy to
okay.
do it. Very happy.
So I'm gonna start. I hope I can make this thing advance the way I want it to. Just welcome to the Vancouver Island, chapter 19. Chapter of carp and our meeting today. Let me see if I can get this thing to advance. I want it to advance, of course it doesn't. Almost. Please. Is it going to cause a problem? I can't get it to respond. Might have to start this again. Just is not. There we go. Let's see if I can get this. Okay. It can't go on, we'll just carry on from here and go to the other one and start. Okay, this is. I can't get this to advance the way I want it to.
Is it the PowerPoint you're trying to advance?
Yes, it is. It won't allow me to advance the slide. And I can't get it to do the other view. They just get that. So I'm just trying to get it to do the often. So, but it won't. Now it won't allow me to do that. So I'm going to just close again. Okay, close. Okay. We are there. Okay. I can get it to advance. We'll go with that and go from there. So sorry about the technical issues. As you can tell, we could use a little assistance with all the technical pieces. But anyway, welcome to our chapter meeting. And it's my delight to, on this National Indigenous Peoples Day, to host this session for those of you online, as well as those of you who are present here, and later for those of you who are on the YouTube function as well. I won't spend a lot of time on the introduction piece because we've invited a longtime colleague and close friend of our speaker today to come and give an introduction. We'll have a little time for Q&A at the end, but she has another engagement immediately after this and had one immediately before this. So she's actually in Ottawa and will be presenting from there. So I now invite Peter to come up and say hello and give greetings.
Thank you, Doug. It is my distinct honor on this National Aboriginal Day, 2023, Indigenous Peoples Day, to introduce to you the chair of the BC First Peoples Cultural Foundation, Dr. Lorna Wanatsa Williams. A Lillooet elder from Mount Currie, BC, Dr. Williams is an educator, filmmaker, author, and Indigenous language expert who has devoted her life to Indigenous education and Indigenous languages. Prior to her role as First Peoples Cultural Foundation Chair, Lorna served as Chair of First Peoples Cultural Council through a period of tremendous growth and recognition, championing BC Indigenous languages, arts, and culture. Throughout her career, Dr. Williams has held a number of senior positions, notably at the University of Victoria as Director of Indigenous Education and Associate Professor in the Faculty of Education, and as Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Knowledge and Learning. Dr. Williams retired from UVic in 2014. Prior to her work in academia, Dr. Williams served as Director of the Indigenous Enhancements Branch of the BC Ministry of Education. She currently serves as the Elder and member of the Ministers' Advisory Council on Indigenous Women, and as a member of the Indigenous Circle for the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Dr. Williams was inducted into the Order of BC in 1993 and as an officer of the Order of Canada in 2019. In 2018, she received an honorary doctorate from Simon Fraser University and received an Inspire Award in 2017, all for her work in Indigenous education and languages. Her collective work is informed by her early development of band-controlled schools in Mount Currie, where she taught and developed Indigenous knowledge curriculum and the Ukwulmuk language. It is so very typical of Wanatsa that at the end of several busy days of travel to and official duties in Ottawa, she would agree to join us via Zoom this evening, her time, to offer her unique wisdom and insights. Please give a warm welcome to a tireless mother, grandmother, elder, and internationally respected champion of Indigenous languages and education. Also my mentor and dear friend, Dr. Lorna Wanatsa Williams.
Peter. Hoekstum kalap stakakte mooi. Stekalap iljona kan muhmin twella. Holsken kalutstumin. Wanos in Squachicha. Silk o lil wadula shwaash in Schnuknuk. Welskan zam iljona titamichsha ki Anishinaabe. It's a great honor for me to spend time with you. My family and people are in a place called Lillooet in the mountains of British Columbia. But today I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Anishinaabe in Ottawa. And I want to thank Peter for the introduction. And I want to thank him for his constant support and friendship. And I want to thank all of you at CARP for organizing this and letting me spend a little bit of time with you. I'm here in Ottawa for some very special occasions. One is this morning I was at Rideau Hall with the Governor General as she distributed the new Order of Canada medals. And I just want to say that today, because it's because it's the Indigenous Peoples Day, most of the recipients were Indigenous, Métis, Inuit, First Nations from across the country, and also those people who are allies and who have worked so hard on our behalf. It was a wonderful morning and greeting friends and just celebrating, and it was wonderful to be in a place in Canada where I could hear our songs, our stories, and the names and work of the people who work on our behalf. Later this afternoon, I was at the opening of the Language Commissioner's new offices in Ottawa. And this is really important because if we're going to make the changes that we need to make to address all of the challenges that we face in supporting Indigenous languages, this office is extremely important, what they do and how they go about their work. It's largely about educating government, but also educating the public and developing good working partnerships. I'm sorry, I may cough occasionally. I'm just getting over a cold. And although it's pretty much gone, it still comes back. So just to let you know that. So I have lots to say. We've been, as Peter said, we've been working on languages for quite a long time. Last week, I attended, for example, the celebration for the Mount Currie Community School, Community School, their 50-year anniversary. Our school was the second school in Canada, the first in BC, to take control over our education. And so much of what I have to share with you today had its beginnings with that work. And in this first slide, I include a slide with the name of First Peoples Cultural Foundation, of which I'm chair, and because I want you to remember that name, because they're the group working with First Peoples Cultural Council who are doing much of the reclamation and revitalization work that we're doing in Canada today. Next slide. So the title of this talk is Untitled, Our Languages. And this is really an important learning experience, I think, for all of you. It's a very special time, as I said, because of those two incidents that happened today, but also because it's this is the first year of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And I want you to know that Canada had a large role in establishing this decade. And we had the Year of Indigenous Languages, the UNESCO Year of Indigenous Languages in 2019. And, we had, it was the beginning, I think, in the world of many places developing their work on Indigenous languages. And we were able to share the work that we're doing here in Canada and to celebrate it. Next slide, please. And so Peter gave my name, Lorna Wenosa Williams. Wenosa is a name that was given to me. It was the last person who had it in our family was one of my grandmothers. And so it's a real honor for me to have this name. And we'll Peter's already given you these, but except for the bottom one, I sit on the UNESCO Committee on Indigenous Languages, both international and national. Next slide. And what are the issues that we're facing? It's important for you to know what they are, even though it's hard to start here at such a negative place, but I want you to just know what Indigenous languages are up against. And the first one is the systemic government and institutional policies that have silenced our languages. And so those need to change. There are government policies, institutional policies that need to change to support our work. And this work is only just beginning. And that's why the Language Commissioner's Office is really critical. And but there's work that needs to be done both provincially and federally. And those policies have been designed to erase our identity, Indigenous identity, the identities of the First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis. And one of the greatest tools for erasure was to annihilate the languages. And so that's what we're up against. And it continues even till today, although, as you'll hear later, they are changing. And there's long established standardization process of colonial languages. And you can see this if you go to, for example, to France. France doesn't recognize any of the languages that are born on their land. And England did the same. English didn't recognize many of the languages, although the Welsh have been working on the revitalization and the use of their languages, for example, for probably as long as we have. And the same with the in Spain, with the Basque and the Catalan languages and other languages. And so it isn't something that is this work on revitalization, the languages of the land is not unique to Canada, but and the ideas, it's important for you to know that the ideas came from the colonizing countries and they were brought here. And so they were tools that were very well established and continue in those mother countries. So it's been many things in this country that have affected our languages. Next slide, please. And for example, probably the first waves of silencing our languages were disease. Tuberculosis, smallpox, TB, the common cold, that first settled on our lands. And so the disease is one, residential schools and the whole schooling process would be another. And so it's such normalized existence in this country that we have to address. And but there are changes, as I said, and in those changes there are some issues. For example, the province of British Columbia added 13 Indigenous languages to make it a possibility to study these languages and use them for graduation credit. That's amazing. That's a first in the country. And so we have to hold up our hands to the province of British Columbia for doing this. But at the same time, there was no planning as to how teachers are going to be acquired for those classes. None. There across this country, there is not one teacher education program for teaching Indigenous languages, and where those teachers will receive that degree would have accreditation. Right now, in some public schools, for example, I met an elder who teaches the language, and she gets $11 an hour to do this work that nobody else can do. And these elders that are called upon often don't drive anymore. And so to get to those classes, they have to find somebody to drive them. And so somebody's taking the time, and they're paid a pittance for their expertise. And so this needs to change. It needs to change both within the institutions, the higher ed institutions. It also needs to change, it needs changes with government. And Indigenous, new Indigenous language learners are learning both to speak and to write and read, but there needs to be support for teaching in all of those three areas, because you have to realize that our languages have become literate languages, only many of them within the last 50 years. And so when you look at languages like English and French and Spanish, that have been literate languages for generations and generations and generations, and you see the challenges they face, they continue to face in that work with literacy and oral languages. And this is something that Indigenous communities are grappling with, and there's very little support for people to do that. When you look at the current technologies, for example, one of the things that there was a report that came out that some of you probably might have read about the 10 languages in the world that are common in the area of technology, and English is more than 50% used in all of technology. And so technology, so the colonizing languages are mainly the languages that are being used and promoted by the tech companies. And if it wasn't for Peter and the work with First Voices and First Peoples and the foundation, the Culture Council and the foundation, our people wouldn't have a keyboard to be able to write in their own languages. And our young people are, they live in a literate world, and they want to be able to use social media to be able to communicate. And so it's it's work that people are doing. Next slide, please. And it's constant. And I think that all I want to say on this slide is, I've covered most of it, is that it's the work of changing of changing the attitudes, changing the policies, and there's so much work that needs to be done in this area. Next slide, please. So it's for example, there are geographic challenges, and in British Columbia, if we believe, as we do, that the language is born on the land, then we have to respect that as the geography changes, the language changes. And we need to respect and honor every language as it's spoken on that land. And so, and because in British Columbia we have such a diversity of ecosystems and geography, then the language that will be reflected in the language. Funding has been a long-term stable funding has been extremely challenging. That's one. But the other is many of the new projects and ideas are funded by nonprofits. And it's been extremely difficult to access this. We're beginning to, we're learning how, and funders are beginning to learn how to support us. But stable, continuous funding to do the work that needs to be done is a real challenge. Systemic racism, as I talked about already, is also a real challenge and continues to be, to make the changes and to acquire the support that we need. And also that everything that exists in Canada is designed on the value system, on the knowledge system, and on the primary value that it's the European, the Eurocentric knowledge that is of value. And so that attitude is barrier. Next slide, please. Next slide. So as I said, the language is born on the land. I just wanted to share with you that this is an extremely important map. It's the first time that Indigenous people themselves were able to place themselves and their languages, their knowledges, and their arts, and anything that they want people to know on a map. And so this is very, very special. And language placement, language names are extremely important because our languages contain the wisdom of our people, and they are our identity. They reflect our languages and all that is on those lands. And it's and when you think about it, within that language, within those place names, can be the knowledge that is needed in order for that land to thrive and to flourish and to provide for us and to nourish us. And but we're up against generations of silencing of our languages, and so we're trying to reverse that. And I want you to know that the work that people are doing is pretty amazing in this province. And everywhere I go, in different parts of the world, people hear about our work. And so it's important for you to know this, because to know what's happening in your own area. And today, for example, one of the challenges is that people hesitate to speak their language because they're afraid that they might not pronounce it properly. They're struggling to speak the language. They speak with an English or French accent, and that's embarrassing to speak your language with that accent. And And so it's really important, that we deal with the trauma, the pain, and the hurt, and help people to overcome them. Next slide, please. I want you to know that that First Peoples has produced, and you can get this on their map. There's a scan that'll come up in the next slide that you can take a picture of, and that'll take you to it. That in 2022, there was a report on the status of BC First Nations languages, and that gives you a real good idea of what's happening with languages. Next slide, please. So this, you can scan or take a picture of it, and it'll take you to the report, and there you can learn a lot more. And so I won't have time in this talk to go through it, in depth. Next slide, please. So First Peoples has now developed 4 reports, and they're developed every 4 years. And I think that if you go to these reports, you can see the changes that have been made, and the impact of the work that First Nations have been doing on their languages. It makes a huge difference. Next slide, please. So there are lots of challenges, but there are lots of positives. And we have, in the last maybe 3 years, received much more funding, both provincially and federal. And again, as I said, it's not stable, but we are getting funds to work with to do the programs that we need. And the United Nations legislation, the UNDRIP legislation, has been adopted and accepted. And as I said earlier, UNESCO's International Decade of Indigenous Languages, there's lots of activity, lots of communication. And I was lucky enough to be invited to the launch in Paris in December, and I led the Canadian delegation of Indigenous peoples into the ceremony, and people were able to share the work that we're doing across this country. And I mentioned the Year of Indigenous Languages. We held, for example, that people still talk about, a gathering in in Victoria of Indigenous peoples from all over the world, and that was very special. And people talked about all the different work that they're doing, the work in technology, but also the countries that are struggling to bring their languages back to life. For example, the people of Cuba, the Indigenous people of Cuba attended. And it's only in the very recent few years that Cuba has acknowledged and recognized that their Indigenous people are not extinct. And so they're beginning the work. They still have their knowledge systems that are so valuable. And there was an Indigenous Language Act that was really important, and out of it came the Language Commissioner. And I talked about the opening of their offices here in Ottawa today. Next slide, please. And in the report, you'll be able to see that there's an increase in learners. And this, I think, is so important, because for so long, people thought that our languages were on the brink of disappearing, and they have been. I'll say that. But at the same time, it's important for us to focus on that there is an increase. So the work that we're doing collectively is making a difference. Next slide, please. And there's more learning opportunities, and I'll let you look at this slide on your own. Some of the programs that are being offered through First Peoples and in other places are language nests. Remember, because of the policies of government that separated children from their families, it's really important that we reconnect our children with their families. It's really important that we reconnect our children with the land and the life on the land and what lives on the land, to care, because what lives on the land cares for us, and we need to reciprocate by caring for the land. And you can find that in our languages. And so there are many language programs in many First Nations communities of bringing people back to the land, reconnecting them with their grandparents and the elder speakers in the community. Head Start programs for language learning in early childhood, and also language programs for adults. And I think that this is probably one of the most significant, because it's the adults who were really the ones who felt the loss of language. And it's important that we provide support, active support for adults to learn their language, so that their children can have somebody to speak to. And we have, you'll be able to see, for example, the work that's being done in First Nation schools. I was telling you, the 50-year celebration of our school in Mount Currie, and to listen to the children, from early childhood to adult, speak their language, use our language, tell stories in our language, sing in our language, is so uplifting and heartwarming. And to see that public schools are doing the same, but also that non-First Nations, the settler communities, are learning. And I received a request last week from and our neighboring settler community, from my community in Mount Currie. So that's Pemberton. They asked if they could put a quotation of mine on a poster for one of their Canada Day celebrations. And so they're wanting to learn, and that's important. And it's important that we work together. Next slide, please. So you'll see, and I talked a little bit about that. And so next slide. And you can just see the increase, and intergenerational transmission is extremely important. Young families are not children as their children's first heard language, and this is okay. And the next slide, please. Next. And so we have lots to be about for the future. And but there's, as I said, there's so much more work that needs to be done. Okay. No. Um, Next slide. And so a new interactive map came out, and this map has information about languages, arts, because the artistic expression is extremely important to get to know the indigenous peoples of these lands. And a whole new area that is fast developing is the area of heritage. And because there's so much work, unique work, that has been done by people in this country, in this province, that people need to know about. And for example, last week I attended, today there's a postage stamp that has an image of George Manuel on it. And George has some books that you can access. But I'm just using him as an example. Very few British Columbians would know about him. And yet he is the one who made such a huge impact on Indigenous peoples' languages, cultures, history, and rights. And for example, we would have no place in the Constitution of Canada had it not been for George and his leadership. And yet, very few people know that. And so to have him now on a stamp, and he never thought too much about the Canada postage, but so I'm not sure how he would feel about now being being an image on their stamps. But I attended. His children were there, and people who participated in many of his actions, and I was one of them. For example, when Canada was patriating the Constitution, they decided that his people would have no say. And so we were being written out. The other piece that was happening is that the Canadian media, the journalism, stopped writing stories about us and the Constitution. We were left out. And so George had this idea for us to travel to Europe, to the colonizing countries, and to tell and to talk to the people there, and to talk to government, and to talk to the media, and through there to talk to third world governments to gain some support, and to also make contact with fourth world governments, and the Sami people in Finland, Sweden, and Norway came and supported us, for example, and so did the Irish, and that meant a lot to us. And we were able to tell our story through their media, so that Canada finally had to tell those stories to its own people. And so I'm just sharing this with you to let you know that we're encouraging and finding ways for people in the communities to tell the stories of the incredible work that their people have been doing to save our languages, our arts, our cultural knowledge, our scientific, environmental knowledge. All that needs to be recorded, documented, and shared so that our young people can access those and have them for themselves as well. So that you can find much of that on the map. You can go to it. You have the link. And next slide, please. And so what is it that you can do? And you can explore, you can learn, and you can look on the map and find information. It's really important for you, each of you, to know the names and the stories of the land on which you find yourself, and not just the larger city or community, but the very place where you live as a name. And it would be wonderful for each of you to know that as a visitor to these lands, as a settler on these lands, that you're connected to a long history of knowledge and identity that is from that land. Next slide, please. So that it helps you to do that, and it's a good beginning. It's so the map is intended for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and there's no other map does this, but we're wanting to create one for all of Canada. Next slide, please. And it's really important that within these you can find the list of First Nations and their languages, and the artists who from those different areas, and also the heritage knowledge and information. Next slide. It's a community-driven platform, and so the people themselves have a say on what is entered, and that's really important. Next slide. Because somebody else has always had that, has been our voice. We've never had a voice for our own. So what can you do? You can support Indigenous language programs in your area and provincially. That's extremely important. It's part of your heritage and your history to learn, as I said, the name of the land where you live. Encourage governments to support the rebuilding of Indigenous languages. We're going to depend on those knowledge systems for our well-being and the well-being of the lands on which we live. Contribute to First Peoples Cultural Foundation, and there'll be a way to scan that in a minute. Do more to increase your knowledge and understanding of the Indigenous peoples of these lands. Next slide, please. And I'll say, Kukstum Kalap, thank you. It's been a wonderful pleasure to spend time with you. We have about 10 minutes for questions or comments. Thank you. And so Doug and Peter, I'll let you organize those. Good to see you. It was good to see your name there, Bonnie.
It's wonderful to see you. And as usual, you've given us so much useful information in such a lovely manner. And I still I'm still amazed at your calendar. How much you do for one little woman.
I have a good time.
Well, you know, and for the other ladies on the call or other people on the call, I've had my own personal journey of discovery on my maternal ancestry in the Fraser Canyon, and you have been such a remarkable friend to me, and I greatly appreciate that. You know that. And I'm even trying some of the language. I've attended 2 language conferences, one up in Lytton, one in Merritt. It was just fabulous. And the International Indigenous Language
Yeah.
Conference that you hosted and the First Peoples Cultural Council hosted here was just phenomenal. I mean, world class. It was recognized by people who attended from all over the world, and it's rightly so. I mean, the work that you've done in British Columbia and across Canada is just, we can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
So the First People Cultural Council website for everybody is it's easy to access, and I haven't gone on myself with this new the new additions with the maps. That's great.
Mhm.
Anyway, I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Bonnie. Okay, so if there are no more questions or comments, I think that, oh, I see somebody talking, but I can't hear you.
There we go. Anyway, I was just mentioning that we really appreciate both what you've had to say, but also the information you've given us as to where we can go if we want more information and the things that we can do to educate ourselves through the process. And I really appreciate the fact that you've managed to shoehorn us in between engagements that you have going on in Ottawa. So Lorna, I really appreciate this very much, Magwitch, and I hope we have an opportunity to interact more as you return to BC, and that there may be additional activities that may go on. So on behalf of the executive committee from Vancouver Island Carp, thank you very much for sparing your time and educating us at the present time. You, like I, have a little bit of a cold, but hopefully that isn't interfering with other activities you've got going on there. And also I'd like to thank Peter as well for introducing you and bringing some literature that we have available here. As I mentioned, this is being recorded. It will be on YouTube later, and that will be an opportunity for others to scan the QR codes that you provided, as well as going on the website. So again, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to give us some information today, and good luck with the rest of your presentations. And then from the people here, we'll just say thank you. Good luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.